We are on chapter 9. Heidi, if you remember when we left off, there's that really great picture at the end of chapter 8. Heidi dancing with Sam the lion. Complete bliss. It's a good moment in time. Things are great. Chapter 9 is entitled Gopher. The crowd roared their approval and then, very suddenly, hushed to silence. They parted as if somebody important was moving through. More murmuring. It's Hamish McLeod. Hidden for all these years. He's come out. Heidi's uncle, still in his robe and pajamas, moved unsteadily toward her, wincing in the noon light as would a prisoner emerging from a dark prison cell. Hiss. He looked at Heidi, then at Sam. He plucked the dog from her head and stretched out his long torso, examining his ears, his nose, toes, fur, and finally the wonderful tuft. He looked back down at Heidi. Where did you get him, niece? The crowd stared. Heidi saw Miss Violet standing off to the side with a plate of little sandwiches. She smiled sadly at Heidi and didn't give her an eyebrow flash. Heidi looked up at Hamish and then at Sam. He just dropped into my life. Is he yours? Uncle Hamish asked. No! Thundered another voice. The crowd parted yet again, revealing Mrs. Nutbush in her blue fur, stomping toward them across the lawn, waving a shipping receipt. Her pointy heels suddenly sank into the mushy patch of grass, and she stopped, struggling to pull free. Heidi dropped the horrified Sam to the ground. Run, she screamed. Run! Run free! Live in the forest! Live like a gnome! Sam didn't run. It had been a confusing day, but one thing was very, very clear. He didn't want to live a life like a gnome. He wanted one thing now, and only one thing. Looking up at Heidi, he knew exactly what it was. Mrs. Nutbush wobbled closer to Sam, arms reaching out ablaze, fur gyrating and flying. Enough is enough, thought Sam the lion. Time for action. He turned to face all the show dogs lined up beside him, and he yelled one word very loud and very clear. The other dogs pricked their ears. There are exactly 4 words that are genetically guaranteed to turn a gaggle of pampered lapdogs into a mob of killers. Federal, Express, Guy are 3 of them. The 4th word is the word that Sam used now, is gopher. You know what a gopher is?
Yep.
Big, fuzzy, furry animal that dogs love to chase. And then they run down the hole in the dog. At the sound of it, the dogs spun their heads and spotted a furry blue rodent of monstrous proportions. Who's the furry blue rodent?
The woman. Go.
Mrs. Nutbush. She's wearing this big furry blue outfit. Mrs. Nutbush froze 5 yards from Sam. 4 dozen of Piddleton's finest purebreds blocked her way, noses flaring. Mrs. Nutbush flared her own nostrils right back at them. Sam uttered the magic word again. Gopher! Gopher! They repeated like a chant. Gopher! Gopher! Goodbye. The human owners dove to avoid the explosion of their howling, barking darlings galloping across the lawn. Leashes ripped from their gloved hands, led by a snapping, saliva-spewing Shih Tzu named Mr. Tinkles, and 52 elegant show dogs chased a screaming Mrs. Nutbush and her blue gopher fur coat through the orange meringue of the dessert table, under the coffee car, and directly through Heavenly Acres' reflecting pond. Now, this is the shocking and violent part of the story. This is a shocking and violent part of the story. There's no need to dwell on the details. All that anyone needs to know is that by the time the Piddleton Police Department removed Mrs. Nutbush from the empty Heavenly Acres dog kennel into which she dived, she was mostly naked, but unhurt. Her blue fur coat, however, would be aggravating the delicate bowels of Piddleton's parlor dogs for weeks to come. Hamish McLeod and Heidi watched as a babbling, blanket-wrapped Mrs. Nutbush was strapped to a gurney and driven away in an ambulance. Her car was towed by the police captain, who turned to Heidi and said that it might take some time until the woman recovered from her emotional collapse. Would Heidi mind looking after Mrs. Nutbush's new Austrian Red Douglas Dachshund and give him a home? Heidi looked at Sam, who looked back at her. She gave him a little eyebrow flash. She thought he gave her one back. Sure, Heidi said quietly. Now there's the word, Heidi thought. Home. Hamish put an arm across her shoulders, and they both turned to walk back toward her new one.